So I love the title soil ecologist. It's like, what the hell is that, right? And it's one of the coolest things that I've seen happening in this movement towards healthy food, looking at the soil, looking at the roots, looking at the nodules, looking at the stuff that goes into the plants that then becomes the food that we eat. So how did you get into this in the first place?
Well, long story short, my two sisters and I grew up as daughters of a national park ranger. So we grew up in pristine mountains of Colorado, the Great Sand Dunes National Park. And eventually I ended up wanting to study urban agriculture. And interestingly enough, I ended up in Iowa to do that. So going from a very pristine, beautiful environment where we could jump into creeks and rivers and climb trees and have clean air, and then going to Iowa, the most man-manipulated state in our country, the breadbasket of America, right? Except for the fact that when I was out there, being there, I realized that the majority of the food that was around me was not fit for human consumption, direct human consumption. The majority of it has to go through the bodies of animals or to be broken down into like corn syrup, right? So I moved to the breadbasket of America, which turns out to be a food desert.
That's amazing.
And it was through living there and witnessing the erosion of soil and witnessing, one day I was sitting on the bank of the Des Moines River and I had just taken my first permaculture course. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking about the 31 million farm acres in Iowa and that 26 million of that grows corn and soy, unfit for human consumption mostly, direct human consumption. And I'm thinking about these things that I've just learned and I'm looking at this chocolatey brown river, right? It's pretty gnarly. And in that moment, a huge chunk of the riverbank fell off of the bank and into the river. And I thought, whoa, right? It was kind of like watching a glacier break away from itself. And for a moment, I thought I should jump on that and just ride it down to Mexico and get out of here. But the other part of me was really sad, Pedram, and very angry. And I consciously stopped myself in that moment and I thought, wow, do I have a lot of energy behind what I've just seen and what I'm experiencing and what am I going to do about it? And I had no idea at the time other than I want to learn how to build soil. And the very next day I met a woman that would become my mentor, Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is a soil microbiologist and prominent world-known soil builder.
What do we need to do to build soil? I think this is kind of an alien concept for a lot of people. Like, isn't soil fine? Isn't it just dirt? And so I really want to tease that out and unpack it because soil is very different than what I think most people see it as.
Soil is living. Soil contains dirt, which is the mineral component of soil. So it's sand, silt, and clay. And when you go from sand, silt, and clay and you add organic matter, plant material, plant roots, plant residues, and you add soil organisms, and you add oxygen and water, now you have the recipe for life to begin. And so in soil is it should be a myriad of diversity of organisms that are going to be microscopic and macroscopic. And it's through their predator-prey relationship, one eating the other, that plant roots are fed. So organisms, through their predator-prey relationship, make the mineral and nutrient component of soil available to plants. And they do that by breaking down the organic matter, and they do that by breaking down the mineral component, and they turn it into a liquid. And that's how plants eat. They eat through solubility, through soluble nutrients.
So this life soup and this interaction that's happening in the soil is what creates the opportunity for life to actually blossom and for plants to sprout and do all the things that we need them to do so we could consume them and kind of hang out here a little higher on the food chain.
Exactly. A fantastic author, Sir Albert Howard, he was writing in the late 1800s. And he writes about soil beautifully, that if soil does not contain enough energy to produce something, it won't.
And that energy comes in the form of vibrating life?
Yeah, it begins with, at least as we understand it for now, through the microscopes that we have available to us now. Imagine the world that we have, the microscopes that have yet to be invented, right, to see the things that we can't see yet. But it's the soil life, and it's the interaction with the organic matter. The organic matter is important because it's food for soil organisms. And soil organisms, bacteria and fungi, are the only organisms that we know of on the planet that have the ability to decompose something. So that means that they are completely taking something apart into its most component parts. And there's no other organism that has the ability to do this on the planet. So when we think about the human microbiome, right, and that the bacterial cells outweigh human cells by 10 to 1, or outnumber human cells 10 to 1, who is actually doing the digesting in our stomach, right? And it's the same thing in the soil. So bacteria and fungi have to break down materials, completely decompose them. Everything else that's bigger than bacteria and fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, macroarthropods, humans. We're all shredders. We're comminuters. We break things down into smaller bits, creating more surface area for bacteria and fungi to completely break these things apart so that we can reassimilate them into plant life that we want to eat, or new babies.
Cells in our body.
There you go.
So before we started recording, we were having a conversation about this farmer who I will introduce you to. Scott Murray is wonderful. He's talking about this farm that had this plastic wrap, and they were just pumping ethyl bromide or methyl bromide and just killing everything wholesale so that they can start over and grow some strawberries. And it was just such a remarkable resemblance to what I see happening in Western medicine with the rampant use of antibiotics, killing off the microbiota in our body to reset, right, so that we can start over. And we know we've done this wrong. But now, what do we do to fix it? And how are we going to kind of reestablish a relationship with the good bugs in our world that are supportive of not just the soil ecology, but our personal ecology? So I want to talk about this because one of the things I think is missing from the conversation, and everyone's go-to now is say, well, just eat organic, right? But the organic farms have to use organic fertilizer. And what are the main ingredients in an organic fertilizer?
Well, we're looking for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium.
Those are the big three.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that you have to add for things to grow.
Yeah.
But there's a lot missing in that statement, right? And and I want to unpack this a little bit because life is in the subtleties. Where's the selenium? Where's the copper? Where are all the trace minerals?
Really important, right? So we've been coming from a long period of study where we've looked at things in isolation, right? We've taken things apart and we've just completely gone into what is it about the heart? What is it about the brain and this side of the brain and that side of the brain? And we've completely isolated everything. And so we've done a really good job at figuring out how things work in isolation. But now we're getting into the world of, my goodness, what happens when these things are working in consortium with one another? So in this world, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Sometimes it equals 5 or 7. So we have to think about wholeness, and that the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. It's just the way that it is. And so when we look at feeding plants through chemistry, right? Like I'm going to add my nitrogen, or I'm going to add my phosphorus, or my magnesium, or whatever. in a sense, it's like saying, oh, well, you need more vitamin C or you need more vitamin D. And so I'm going to give you these things and you're going to feel better. Well, it's a little bit different taking vitamin C than it is eating an orange or broccoli or going out into the sun, right? So when we can add whole foods into the soil system, essentially, then what takes place is our plant can actually, it knows what it needs. And through its plant roots, it communicates to soil organisms through something called root exudates. And the chemistry of root exudates changes. And when that changes, it triggers a different biological response. So when the plant needs more nitrogen, say, because it's spring and it needs to put on a fresh flush of green growth, it's going to trigger, through its plant root exudates, cakes and cookies of the soil, if you will, carbohydrates, sugars, proteins. It's going to communicate to the soil biology around it, and the bacteria are going to consume those sugars, reproduce. One bacteria becomes 2 every 20 minutes. There's 100 million to 1 billion soil organisms in a teaspoon of soil, so that gives you a frame of reference for like what we're talking about in the power of the soil. And so these organisms are reproducing, and then it's that predator-prey relationship, right? So something eats the bacteria, and now the nutrients that are in the bacteria go back to the plant. And so the plant gets to drive its fertility requirements, and it works as long as the diverse soil biology is there.
So we've been tilling and extracting from the dirt, if you will, because the soil is pretty much depleted here in our farmland, Iowa, everywhere, until now the topsoil is really devoid of much of the life that it used to have back in the day. And so it's obviously reflected in the food, and now we're using petroleum-based stuff and chemicals to just force plants to grow in soil that isn't necessarily teeming with life anymore. Are we talking about composting? Are we talking about, like, what kind of methodologies do you bring to bear on this? Because I've also heard that, like, it's fine if you go compost, but the foods that you're eating are already mineral deficient, so it's still, like, the selenium's still not in your banana peel or whatever it is. So how do you actually bring that kind of diversity of minerals and kind of raw ingredients back?
Well, we begin by responsible composting, so not all compost is created equal. How do you know if what you're looking at is good compost? Well, it would be the color of 70% cocoa. What does that look like? Go buy a chocolate bar. If it's black, then it's been cooked at temperatures that are very high and will actually, in essence, sterilize your compost, so you have a very low diversity of microorganisms in the compost. It should smell good. You should feel absolutely comfortable to reach your hand into that pile and put it at your face and take in a big, deep breath. If it doesn't fit those criteria, then there's some things that you can do to take care of that. But adding in good compost into a system is the most important aspect, one of the most important aspects, but it has to happen in conjunction with adding in organic matter. The majority of our soils, Pedram, are bare because we till them, and we don't want weeds because weeds are competition, right? Weeds are actually Mother Nature's way of covering herself and stabilizing soil. So we would do much better to look at weeds as a tool for stabilizing soil and actually feeding microbial life.
Interesting. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because that's fascinating. Because everyone I know who gardens is like, oh, I got all these weeds and bugs.
Okay, so you have these weeds in a growing system, and what are they offering? What's the point? The point is that they are a symptom of a system out of balance. If you want to grow tomatoes, now you need to go from where in nature weeds set in and grew and died and grew and died and grew and died, and other plant species came in, all of that organic matter added into the soil, feeding below ground life, to set up the stage of succession for growing tomatoes.
So if you had weeds, do you you pull them and just put them under the earth? You just bury them right where they were? Do you take them and you compost them? I'm trying to visualize what you do with this, or do you just leave them in the ground until they're ready?
Right. So in order to get weed seeds to not germinate, to not be there any longer, your soil will need more organic matter. Go walking through a forest, look at the understory. Are there weeds? No. Why? Because the soil biology is different. It's more fungal dominated. What does that mean? Fungi break down carbon, and they're really good at it. Carbon, things like wood chips, fall leaves, straw, these are additions that you should be putting into your garden, protecting the soil with them, mulching. Additionally, you can choose what plant species you want to cover your bare soil. A permanent understory, low-growing species, so that the soil is covered and it doesn't want to germinate weeds.
So you cover the soil in some organic matter that then feeds the right bacteria, which then creates an environment where the plants that you want to grow have the soil kind of microbiology that's favorable to their growth. So if you're seeing the weeds, it's because your soil microbiota are off?
That is one, yes, that is one of the many indicators. Also, mineral component of soil is important to note as well. So the soil biology component is one tool in like a triad of things to consider when growing. Organic matter, mineral, soil biology, all these things fit together. So the soil biological component, yes, what you're saying is as we feed fungi, then we shift from a nitrate dominant environment to a more ammonium dominant environment.
Where we can grow the good stuff.
Where you can grow the good stuff. Now, the succession above ground, below ground mirrors that succession. And so how can you get it in? Understand that bacteria like to consume simple sugars. That's pretty easy to remember for those of us that are really interested in human health, right, and taking care of our own biome. When you eat a lot of sugar, you get a lot of bacterial growth in the body and non-beneficial fungi as well. The same thing can happen in the soil if you add a green material into the soil or you till it in, let's say, you're feeding bacteria. So you're going to get the environment that responds to bacterial flushing, weeds. So for your home gardener, mulching is very important, and especially for California right now, this year. With all of the rain coming, this is a perfect time to build up good soil biology.
Let's talk about this fungi bacterial balance.
Yeah.
Because this is something that, you know, when I hear good biology, I always think, oh, well, it must be the bacteria. But you're saying the bacterial overgrowth also creates nitrate-based ecology, which is more for weeds and less for preferable plant species. And the fungi help metabolize and keep those colonies at bay?
Actually, so our bacteria and fungi are the fertilizer bags. So the fungi is going after the carbon component of organic matter, the brown material, right? It's also going after the mineral component of soil, breaking down sand, silt, clays. So we have two sets of fertilizer bags. Now, depending on how much organic matter is in the soil and on the soil, then we have a response in terms of below ground soil biology. So if you don't have a lot of carbon in your soil, then you're not going to have a lot of fungi. If you have some carbon and a lot of additions of green materials, like tropical environments, then you're going to have predominantly more bacteria.
It's more sugary.
Yeah, so it doesn't stop there, and actually, it's interesting because at a lot of conventions that I attend nowadays, the majority of the products that are out for treatment on land are selling themselves as diverse microbial inoculants, let's say, probiotics for the soil, if you will. Bacteria travel really well. You can put them in a bottle and you can put the lid on the bottle. And the bacteria, many of them are still going to be okay. Your aerobic bacteria, They would do what you and I would do if we were sealed in a plastic bottle.
Suffocate.
Right. They would go to sleep and then eventually die. So that's another conversation. But as important as bacteria is, and as important as a diversity of bacteria is, and knowing that you will get benefits and you will see change in your garden by adding a diversity of bacteria, you cannot forget the other organisms. And that's something that's really forgotten in the conversation that's happening around the soil food web right now. I think it has to do with companies that are making products. A high quality compost should be made in every county to supply the county, because how do you feel when you travel over to Europe and back? Mm-hmm. Are you like top notch? Probably.
Beat up. No,
you're a little bit beat up. Okay,
yeah.
That's good to know.
No one cannot take that punch. It's
right?
You're up there in a tin can.
Yeah. So it takes you a while to recover. Mm-hmm. And for these organisms, when we transfer them, like in a sealed bag, and they've been sitting out in the parking lot baking in the sun, our beneficial aerobic organisms go dormant or die. And our disease-causing organisms wake up. So it's important to know that soil life will respond to the treatments that are happening to it, right? Mm-hmm. If you've got an anaerobic soil, or you have a completely devoid soil, you've got dirt, your soil biology will respond to that.
Mm-hmm. So how do we go about inoculating? Is this something that, like, if I have a home garden, is there like a person to call to say, hey, send me the good stuff? Mm-hmm. Or do I go outside and learn how to compost better? I mean, it sounds like, the hubs that you're proposing are, probably not there in every locale that we're talking to.
Not yet, but it's happening. It's very exciting. Extension agencies, National Resource Conservation Service, these people advise farmers on how to have more productive lands. And so these people are starting to encourage more of this education. But what I recommend is that if you want to do something with your kitchen waste, then you should. I think that it's important to take responsibility for the food waste that we produce. It's actually a resource. It's coming from all over the world, and we are taking minerals and nutrients from that place. Maybe it's not in the balance that we understand it should be in, but nonetheless it's there. So simple ways of composting. If you want what's called a static compost pile, you've got your container in your kitchen. Maybe you empty it after every meal or at the end of the day, and that gets all of your food waste. And you bring that out to the backyard, and in a wood pallet bin, or you can buy nice looking bins as well, you would have a layer of wood chips or leaves or straw, and then you would make a deposit of your food bucket. Mm-hmm. And you would make another deposit equal to the amount that was in your food bucket of another brown material. It's going to require a little bit of hydration, but essentially you just fill up the container. It should have airflow through it. It should have access to the earth. But you fill up the container in this way: food waste bucket, organic matter deposit, all the way to the top. Keep it hydrated. Turn it a couple times a year. It'll break down very slowly. It'll take some time. You can start a new pile. You can also vermicompost. There's a great book called Worms Eat My Garbage. And that can teach you how to be a vermicomposter, very easy. Mm-hmm. Kids really get into it. The other thing is you can seek out your local CSA, community-supported agriculture, or a neighbor in your area that maybe is composting. Many people that are practicing community-supported agriculture are composting and are looking for materials to compost. Mm-hmm. So how nice that you're getting your vegetables from them, and you're also making a donation to soil fertility.
Right.
So how do you inoculate soil, right? Now you've got this great compost that you're going to add in. How do you know it's great? So you've got those parameters that we talked about, but I highly recommend getting a microbial analysis done. Who's in there? What kind of fertilizer bags and openers do you have available? So you find this out. And you can add in your compost, and really that should go below your mulch layer so that the organisms are protected. And again, this is the time to do it, California.
So in the mulch layer is wood chips or leaves or something so that you don't have the soil directly exposed.
Right, and it's food for the organisms. So regenerative agriculture, what is it? It goes beyond sustainable agriculture. It goes beyond organic agriculture. How? Because one bacterium becomes 2 in 20 minutes, right? These are organisms, all life seeks to derive carbon to fuel metabolism. So we get the organisms out, and now we need to make sure that they're going to be fed. That's why I call this work micro-herding, understanding understanding what these organisms need and how to get them to grow and to flourish and be happy in the soil. So you add organic matter, you add the compost. How much compost? Let's say on an acre, you would add a ton of compost. That's not actually that much compost for an entire acre. But it also depends on what you have in your soil right now. So those rates can change, and then it also depends on how much compost you have available. But for the home grower, there's the 3 things to consider, right? It's covering our soil, taking care of your waste, which is actually a resource, and the other thing is wash your dishes. Because if you wash your dishes in California and you wash them in a tub in your sink, you use less water, which by the way comes from the Colorado River, which is a long ways away, and not many Californians recognize that. The other thing is that water now goes out to your garden. And soap is not inhibitory to plant life. If it's antibacterial soap, well then yes. But this is a way that you can maintain your plant life around your yard. You could even put it into your compost pile if you want.
So you just go dump your dishwater onto the compost pile and let
Do it.
Cook it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
It's a resource. You know, we create so many things that we call waste, and it's actually incredibly valuable to nature because nature is full of closed loop systems. So how do we mimic that in our homes and in everything that we do? We get much more efficient, right?
So we're going to do a soil analysis of my garden. And so what happens? So we're going to send it off to a lab, and they're going to come back and say, here's what you got, here's what you don't. And then we find some sort of nuanced way of replenishing the right types of bacteria and fungi. Like how is this going to look? Okay,
here's how it's going to look. You're going to send your soil samples to the lab, and what you'll get is called a qualitative soil analysis. So what does that mean? That means that you'll understand what organisms are present and active and cycling nutrients right now. And then we come up with a treatment, sourcing a good high quality compost, and we come up with a treatment plan based on what you can do and how involved you want to be. If you want to follow some application plans like adding compost in the fall, adding more compost in the spring, doing sprays of foliar amendments onto the plants, we can do that. If you want to make a change right now and you want to see the change as quickly as possible, then essentially after every compost application, 2 weeks later, we would be doing another soil analysis, and then we would make a recommendation based on what to add next.
What's cooking?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Great. So I love where this is going because I think the foundation of medicine is now being rattled by the microbiota and the epigenetic expression of what we're finding is actually coming from the bacteria. And now we're tracing it back to the root nodules, and we're tracing it back to kind of the source. So let's go up into orbit here and kind of look down at the future of what this is promising. Bringing life back to the soil sounds like it's going to take some work because we spent a lot of time pulling it out. But starting to do that on, fine, in my garden, that's cute, but we're talking about like agricultural scale and really building that out. Yeah. How long would it take for us to make a significant impact in the the food shed for this country as we start to build that out?
That's a great question. And I'm going to give you a standard ecological answer, which means it depends. But when we start bringing in good biology, we see a change within that growing season. When we see sustained changes, such as, if you're on an airplane, the amount of energy that it takes to get you from ground level to altitude is significantly greater than what keeps you at altitude. Mm-hmm. So what's that time period that we're going through? About 3 years, if the grower is working with organic matter and mineral component in the soil as well.
Great. So we could turn this entire thing around, get more nutrition out of food, get higher yields out of food, and bring the essential kind of trace minerals and all the good stuff back into our food, which personally, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think a lot of the healthcare crisis is now happening because we haven't been eating real food for a while, right? And that's not too revolutionary, but a lot of it might be coming from the soil, and the soil not providing that into the kind of baseline food chain, right?
Absolutely.
So how does one get a hold of you and people like you to then now start applying these principles to their crops?
Great. So you can get a hold of me through contacting me via email, molly.lscl@gmail.com. I also have a blog that has information about how to send soil samples to me. It's called A Microherder's Manifesto. And I don't regularly post blog posts. I use it a little bit more of a way for people to see where I'm at in the country, sharing, giving workshops. But the biggest thing right now, how people can participate in this work and understand more, you can go to the soilfoodweb.com, and there's a ton of information if you want to become a microherder. There's a company that I'm working with right now called the Fair Carbon Exchange. And this is a brilliant company, Pedram. I mean, what Jimmy Sinton is putting together is a really beautiful design in supporting, rewarding, paying our farmers for responsible farming practices. And how he's doing that is by paying them through the carbon that they sequester in the soil. So we are finding people that seek carbon credits and taking those credits, applying them to the farmers and rewarding them for storing carbon, for sequestering carbon. But the other thing that Jimmy's doing that no other company that I'm aware of is doing is education in regenerative agriculture, soil biology techniques, is a part of what the farmer receives. So we train the farmer on soil food web methodology so that he can more quickly sequester the carbon in the atmosphere, sequester the carbon into the soil. And right now there's a crowdfunding on Rocket Hub, and it's called Reverse Climate Change, the Natural Way. And you can donate to support the work that we're doing. We've got 1,000 farmers lined up to receive education and begin this work in South Africa right now, and we'll be beginning this work on the Navajo Nation as well.
Great. Let me just make sure I got this right. He's bringing people that are wanting to take carbon credits, to basically swap those credits, basically sequester the carbon through the farmers and pay money to the farmers. So they're actually financial rewards through the swap system for the farmers to actually sequester that carbon for the big carbon emitters who are paying for it.
Yes, and there's a little bit of work that has to be done really for this to come out smoothly. Really, as you know, research, you have to establish baselines of how are we monitoring carbon sequestration. But an interesting point is that the amount of carbon that's been released into the atmosphere is incredibly high due to mostly agricultural practices. A massive amount of carbon was in the soil, and because of the tillage and disturbance, it is no longer. So when we sequester carbon in the soil, every 1% increase in soil organic matter, or carbon, equals the water holding capacity of 1 acre inch of rain. So think of 1 inch of rain over an entire acre now held in your soil because you've increased carbon. So when I'm talking about carbon, I'm not saying you take a tree and you bury it, right? When I say carbon, I'm talking about bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. All of those organisms are made of carbon. And they're reproducing at a wild rate if the environment's right for them.
That's interesting. So you bring the carbon back into the soil, you then inoculate and allow the life to really start springing up in the soil again. And not only have you taken care of some of the climate change issues, but you've also taken care of some of the food shed issues.
Yeah.
I love where this is going. I really do.
We can reverse climate change, actually. The white paper published or put out by the Rodale Institute, if you want to read it, go to the Rodale Institute website, search the white paper. Let's see, it's called Regenerative Organic Agriculture and Climate Change. And in that paper, it discusses and shows a lot of work that's been supporting what they're saying is that in the next 10 years, if all of the farmers that are practicing agriculture started practicing regenerative agricultural methodologies right now, in 10 years, we would sequester the amount of carbon that's been released in the environment since the industrial era.
Wow. You mean Rodale, like Rodale the publisher?
Yeah. There's a lot of work coming out through them, and
Go Rodale.
Yeah.
They're my publisher for my next book, by the way.
Oh, fantastic.
I love them. They're great company.
Yeah. So carbon sequestration is important for a lot of reasons, and what we see is that it's becoming a greater issue. More people are suffering from sea levels rising, right? We have a myriad of these climatic issues. And for the companies that are emitting a large amount of carbon dioxide, okay, so they may end up having to pay a carbon credit. Pay a carbon tax. And South Africa will be imposing this. So they can pay that tax, or they can pay you for your regenerative farming practices, encourage you, support you. Now, not only are you saving water on your farm, not only are you saving on petroleum for the amount of disturbance you're adding into your land and the amount of times that you have to go out there and spray herbicides, right? But you're also beginning to grow food that has greater mineral and nutrient content. So all of a sudden, Pedram, we're taking farmers, spelled F-A-R-M-E-R-S, and we're turning them into our pharmacists, right? I mean, it's our farmers with a PH. And they should be compensated for that work because they are the ones that are providing us the nutrients. And I love my doctor, but I would be so much happier to pay my farmer for my health program and my nutrient program. And I think my doctor would agree, right? Yes, let's pay these people and support them for practicing responsible agriculture.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
I'm going to get links to put in the blog post that goes
Great.
with this story. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. It's awesome, and we're going to follow it. We're going to play in my little garden in my house, and we're going to keep kind of following this around. Great work. Thank you.
This is a perfect time to do it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.